Hi, welcome to Laguna Woods Show, where every guest matters. Today we have a very special guest. He's a Korean War veteran, and his name is Norman Jones. Hi, Norman.
Hey, how are you this morning?
It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you very much.
You met so many incredible people in your life, like Reagan, President Reagan, and Nixon, and Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas. But let's start with your experience with the Korean War. What stands out the most in your mind about the Korean War, what you went through?
The way the Korean War probably would be, the people from the North and the South, they've always wanted to be one group.
Yeah.
And when the communists took over the north part, it separated them. And the people, as of today, they're very first that they want to have one country.
Yes, yes.
They have one language. They only want one country.
Yeah. So then, I mean, you were injured and you had malaria. I mean, you want to talk about that?
I'm sorry?
You were injured and then you had malaria. Do you want to talk about malaria? I don't know, I mean...
Well, I got the type of malaria that when they were building the Panama Canal, they called it blackwater fever. And the urine turns black and you get, your face all turns yellow and your eyeballs change a different color.
Wow.
And during the canal, in building the Panama Canal, 6,000 people died from that. It's caused by a mosquito.
Wow.
But there's 4 types of malaria, and that's called blackwater fever.
Wow. Do you still suffer from it in some ways?
Well, the medical people say that after you have this type of malaria, that you should never give transfusions. Wow. So I can't give anybody a transfusion.
Wow. So, in some way, at one point, you were fighting with close combat, fighting. Was this difficult? Was it difficult for you?
Yes, but I learned something quite early, what they mean by self-preservation.
Yeah.
During the conflict, I was in Japan when the war started. And the war started at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 25th of June 1950. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I landed at the airport in Kempo Airport. And at that time, I was in military intelligence, and I had gone back and forth between Korea and Japan. General MacArthur was not very happy with the people in the Pentagon, so he wanted to keep his own people a later aspect. So from the time I was there in June until I left on October 5th, 1950, I was wounded 4 different times. They pulled me out of the combat area and were sending me to Fort Riley, Texas, Fort Riley, Kansas, to be officers candidate school. But when I landed, I flunked the test because of the malaria, and I spent 10 months in an Army hospital.
Wow.
Recovering from the wounds and the malaria.
You met so many incredible people in your life. Who shall we start with? Maybe General Douglas MacArthur. Let's start with him. What's your relation with the...
Of course, I was in military intelligence, and I worked for General Willoughby and Colonel Bratton. Yeah. General Willoughby was the G2 officer on MacArthur's staff. That means intelligence officer.
Yeah.
And so when anybody would come into Tokyo either from the Pentagon or from the State Department, that they would have me bring all the documents from the safe, and a lot of times I'd bring them in and give them to the General MacArthur, and he'd tell me to sit down, and I'd sit and listen. So I knew everything that went on prior to the Korean War.
This is General MacArthur.
Oh, that's a picture of MacArthur.
Yes.
That was given to me and signed by Mrs. MacArthur. That's the only picture that was ever given by her, signed by her.
And you have this too.
Right. Now that is the
guns. How do you hold it like
that is the pistol that MacArthur used in World War I.
Yeah.
And when he was on Corregidor during the Second World War, he left it on Corregidor with my uncle, who was a Marine, and so at that night he fled to go to Australia. And so later on, my father was found out about it, and we returned it to MacArthur Library.
So, okay, do you want to talk about Reagan? You knew him. What's your relation to Reagan?
I met Reagan after while I was going to college in '53 at University of Southern California.
Yeah.
Reagan at that time was the head
governor.
of the head of the officer, the Guild
Screen
Union.
Actors Guild. Okay, Screen Actors Guild.
Right, and so I met him through that, because I represented companies, and of course he was representing the union.
Yeah.
And I was introduced by him by Charlie Bickford. Charlie Bickford, the old movie star.
Here is a picture of you and Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Where was that taken, this picture?
That was in 1991.
And where was it taken?
It was taken in Cedar City, Century City, California. That was up at his penthouse after he retired from the office in Washington, D.C.
Okay. So, you were involved with the flight controllers. You remember the flight controllers with Reagan? The flight controllers that they decided to be on a strike?
The controller strike was in 1981. And President Reagan was elected in November, and then he took office in January the following part of the year.
Yeah. And
after 2 weeks in his office, I get a call from French Smith. French Smith was the personal attorney of the president, and he said, "Jones," he said, "what do you know about federal employees going on strike?" And I started to laugh. And he said, "Why are you laughing?" I said, "I got a call from several years ago when Nixon was in the White House that they were talking about the postal workers going on strike." So I did a complete survey of it, and I said, "I'll send it to you." And he said, "Like hell you will. You'll be on the plane, and we'll pick you up in the morning." So I flew to Washington, D.C. We spent 5 days deciding what we want to do. And the last night that I was there, I woke up with a lot of new ideas. So I woke French Smith up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we met again the following morning about 7, and we decided that we could stall off the strike if they're going to strike it, but we needed time to retrain some of the people. And then also I had the idea that the Air Force has controllers. So why couldn't we use the Air Force controllers to do the other work? So they thought that was a great idea. So that's what happened. So we stalled negotiations with the union from January of '81 until August, and that's when the controller strike took place. We had 16,000 controllers across the United States, and about 15,000 decided to walk off. Within 2 days, we had the air operation all back because we used people in the military.
Okay, you were instrumental by the returning back of the POW remains.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Okay, in 1990, I'll go back. I'll spend maybe half a minute.
Okay.
My wife died in '72, and she left with me with a 6-year-old son. And one of the things that we talked about was that she wanted me to not only hire a nanny, but she wanted me to keep a promise that I made to an a major that was a Korean War, and he's the one that saved my life. So I decided to write the book. So I met the people from the Korean War Association, and they said that we have 8,500 guys that were POW MIAs, and we really don't know anything about it. So they said, hey, you negotiate. Why don't you represent us and negotiate with the North Koreans? At that time, North Korea and South Korea were not members of the United Nations.
Yeah.
So they were just things of that. So I met a guy that was the head man from North Korea. His name was Ho Jung. And I negotiated with him over a 6-month period of time, and he finally agreed that they would return 5 remains, and they hadn't had any remains returned since '54. This was in 1990. So I was successful in negotiating, and because in our country we can't negotiate individually, we have to do it through the State Department. Mm-hmm. So we got a letter from the State Department saying that we could negotiate with the North Koreans for not only the remains, but if there were any people alive to bring them back.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I did, and so when we had a person that was from the Veterans Administration that was also a congressman. So he and 6 congressmen flew to South Korea with myself as a visitor,
Negotiator,
I guess.
visitor.
So then we picked up the 5 remains. Mm. And so that was the start. And so then the following year we picked up 8. In the following year we picked up 22.
Oh, wow.
So that was roughly a little over 30 people, but out of the only 8,500. And now, since what's happened, I'm rewriting the book on a second time. Yeah. And then, of course, our President President Trump. Started to meet with the North Koreans. So I decided to write him a letter saying, why don't you bring back the remains? Yes, yes. Because I can remember in 1990 when I met President Reagan at his penthouse. Yeah. I also offered him to do it, but his wife said that he was too sick to do it. Oh. So then that letter was written on May 7th, 2018, and then of course President Trump started meeting with the North Koreans in June. Mm. So one of the three agreements was that he was going to bring back all the remains that they would furnish. Wow. So that's what's happening. Mm. So last week they brought back 16 remains. Wow. Mm. So I have fulfilled my obligation.
Wow. Let's go back to Nixon. How did you meet Nixon?
Well, Nixon was a senator from the state of California.
Yeah.
And my mother lived in Southgate, California, and my uncle was mayor of Southgate, California. And they were both on his committee.
Yeah.
And so when he was elected president, he invited them back, and I went with him. Mm-hmm. So that's the first time I met Nixon.
Yeah.
But I met him later on when when he was a vice president, and I represented a company in Los Angeles at the time that made TVs.
Yes.
And they also had a department that made what they call the rotation bomb. When they would drop a bomb, it would spin.
Yeah.
And so they, whenever they would have negotiations with the union, they said that they were going to go on strike. So the federal government stepped in to negotiate so there'd be no strike.
Yeah.
So I represented the company. Then the union was there, and then of course Nixon was vice president.
Yeah.
So he come in and talked to both sides of us back and forth.
Yeah.
And so then he finally left the union in one room, we were in the other room. And so then Nixon come back from the union and said, well, if you accept the union proposal, there'll be no problem. And so I said, under no conditions we'll give them only the one we offer. It's good, we won't make any offer. So that was the first time that I got involved with Nixon again. So that was an interesting.
And then he wanted you to be in his cabinet.
Right. So then later on, I have a letter here from him saying that he wanted me to be involved in the country aspect. They wanted me to be the Secretary of Labor, but because my dad had died the day before Christmas, and then my wife was terminal cancer, she died 5 months later. So I was in between of that, and I couldn't do anything about it.
So other people that everybody knows is Bob Hope. You knew Bob Hope. How did you know Bob Hope?
Well, Bob Hope again is, I knew him because he gave a lot of meetings with the troops during the Second World War.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And so I ran into him when he was on a movie set, and of course I told you about that I had represented Charlie Bickford. They were very good friends. And so anyway, he had a lot of property, and so when they find out people that are in the movie industry, at that time they were at 80% income tax.
80%,
so
wow.
Most of them then had to invest their money outside of things.
Yeah.
So they investigated in small countries, small companies. So one of the companies was non-union, and so I represented that company, and that's how I started meeting Bob Hope, because he was involved with property.
You were on a plane with him?
Yeah, okay. And then later on, the last time that he ever gave anything in front of a troop was in 94. He and his wife and his dog and myself flew on his private jet from Burbank to Washington, D.C. to go to the Korean War Vet Association. And he was failing in health, but he sat on a high chair and along with his wife, and they talked back and forth, and they had us laughing so much we could cry, but I think he was more funny than he was. But that was the last time that I spent with him. So that was in 94.
That was in 94. Let's see. You met Howard Hughes. I mean, how did you meet him?
I met Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes started. His father had what we called, was named Hughes oil tool that they had in Texas, and he had a lawyer that was a Mormon, and so all during his growing up, he'd always heard about the good Mormons because the attorney was a good aspect. So that's the one reason why that from the history that Howard Hughes had Mormon people around him. So I met him because he got into Las Vegas.
Yes.
He owned most of the gambling hotels.
Yes.
And they belonged to what they call the Gambling Association.
Uh-huh.
And in labor relations, when you give your bargaining rights to some other party, and then they had given it to the Gambling Association.
Yeah.
He didn't like the unions.
Yeah.
So then he wanted to get out of the unions. So we had to give them notice to get out. And one of the fellows that was involved was supposed to notify the union and the association at least 90 days before, or not less than 60 before, when the contract expires.
Mm.
So what happened was what we call a Jack Mormon. He was a heavy drinker, and he got drunk and didn't give the notice to the union in time. So Howard Hughes could not get out of the contract.
Uh-huh.
So then that's the one reason why he decided to sell out and leave Vegas.
And you are a Mormon too? You're a Mormon?
Yes, I'm a Mormon.
That's why
So anyway, that sort of goes back to it.
Yeah. Let's see. How about John Wayne? How did you meet him?
As I said, my wife died of cancer, and I took my younger son over to Catalina.
Yeah.
And the storm come up, and so he was there with his yacht. So he had to get off his yacht and stay in the hotel. And he stayed in the same hotel that we did. So then I met him at breakfast with my six-year-old boy. And then we started a friendship. And then he got involved with some companies. So he wanted me to represent the companies. So that was my experiences with him. And of course, as you probably know, I become a very good friend of a very interesting person, Chiang Kai-shek, in China.
Yeah.
The head of the Chinese government.
Yeah.
And then when the Chinese communists took over in 1949,
yeah,
he fled to Formosa, which is now Taiwan.
Yeah.
And he had an older son, was the general. I met his wife also, and his son, the general, come after we had the special meeting on Taiwan. He come to Japan, and at that time he gave me what they call a forbidden stitch.
Yeah.
That I have a picture of it here.
Yeah. Let's see if I can find it.
That's probably.
I don't know if I can find
it. Anyway, it's called a forbidden stitch because they go blind by making it. It's a petty point, needle point.
Yeah.
So that's.
Okay, let's see who else. You met Cesar Chavez?
Cesar Chavez.
Yes, Chavez.
Cesar Chavez was a union representative that was trying to organize the grape workers in California.
Yeah.
And so I represented people in the same industry. Oh, here it is.
This is the stitch.
Yes, that's the forbidden stitch.
This is the forbidden stitch.
Right there. And as I said, as you can tell it, you can actually, that's why we got the nickname, the Go Blind.
Yeah, because they did it
Right.
so small.
Right.
Okay. So where were we?
I'm sorry?
Where were we?
So anyway, he represented the unions and I represent the companies.
Yeah.
And this was the time when excuse me.
Going back to Reagan.
I'm sorry?
Going back to Reagan, how was Nancy?
Nancy, many times I spent with her, very truthfully, she would tell you where she stood on the subject and where you stood, even though you might have differences of opinion.
Yeah.
She was always talking about what a great husband she had, not only because he was president, because he was a man's man. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, but going back to Chavez.
Yeah.
Chavez, at the time they had the
you know what? Let's go to General MacArthur that says, I should be back.
I should return.
Should return. What happened there?
MacArthur was on the island off of Manila, Texas.
Yes.
And he had, that's where he had his weapon.
Yeah.
And he said it was jammed, and so he gave it to my uncle, who was at the time. And so then MacArthur left that night by PT boat to go to Australia, and so then that's why how I got a hold of the gun through my uncle.
Oh. Well, you know, time ran out. We're running out of time.
Okay.
It was so nice having you here, and we're going to have you again. You didn't even touch about any. There were so many stories that you're going to.
Well, I'm sorry.
Have to come back.
I'm sorry that I got fouled up with Chavez.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's.
We're going to have you on again.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Enjoyed.
Thank you for watching, and we'll have another interesting person. Bye.